This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 114 of Here's How for the 5th of November 2020. Sex work is something that attracts strong opinions on all sides. Let's hear from someone who actually knows what she's talking about.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
Here's what we've got coming up for you in this podcast. Are you sure that's just a coincidence? Isn't it much more likely that people who are marginalised, people who are vulnerable, are ending up in sex work because they're marginalised and vulnerable?
That's kind of the key in a way, that so often people do sex work when they have little to no other options. And so again, what we're looking for is alternatives.
That's coming up shortly. But first, I want to thank all of my donors on Patreon. I really appreciate everyone who does that. If you don't know, Patreon is a system that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, and that helps me to devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. If you think that you could do the same as them, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. But for now, much as I appreciate those patrons, I'm not going to be retiring in the Bahamas anytime soon. And in the area of my life that actually puts bread on the table, I have a big project on at the moment. So this, I'm sorry to say, will be the last Here's How podcast of 2020. I hope to be back bright and early in January 2021, and with that, a couple of announcements. The first is that I'm open to having a collaborator on the podcast. If you're interested in doing that, or you know someone who might be, get in touch. The email is podcast@here'show.ie. This isn't a paid position, but it doesn't require too much input. A good knowledge of Irish current affairs would be helpful, not to mention a bit of fire in your belly, but there's no need to be in ideological lockstep with me. I don't even think that would be possible. It would take a couple of hours a week. It might be helpful if some of them could be in working hours, but that's not totally necessary. I envisage this being done remotely, so you would have to have access to a computer and an internet connection at a minimum. Also, I'd be more than willing to provide training on all the software used. I'm open to suggestions, but my idea would be to have someone either as a co-producer or co-presenter or both. The second item is that I get some basic statistics on what traffic comes into the website for the podcast. And that brings me to this. There's one particular phrase that I think troubles some people, and I've heard it many, many times on RTE. What does known to Gardaí mean?
Known to Gardaí, I suppose, that isn't just a phrase you hear on RTE. It's common to all media outlets. I'm not sure the context of your question. I mean, if you'd like to give me an example, I could perhaps elaborate.
I genuinely don't know what it is. I mean, I know a few of the lads on first name basis in my local station. If you reported about me, would I be known to Gardaí?
I really don't get the point of the question. I mean, it would depend entirely on the context in which we were reporting on you or your activities. Known to Gardaí is perhaps a pejorative phrase. It's something we're careful about using. But for example, it has been used widely in the media as a code for people who have criminal intent, for example. That's a clip from an interview that I did with Donal O'Byrne, the editor of RTE's Morning Ireland, back in the day when RTE would sometimes take my calls, June 2016 to be precise. I put it in there because, as I said, I don't have any way to know who views the website, but I do see what pages are popular on any given day, and for some reason the page for that particular episode every so often gets a huge burst of web traffic. On days when it happens, that one page alone from 2016 can account for as much as 90% of the traffic on my website. Maybe it's just that it's particularly smiled on by the Google gods who send traffic, but I sort of think that someone must be recommending it, and I'm sort of curious. If you have any ideas,
please send me an email or tweet at Here's How Podcast to let me know. So, I hope the rest of 2020 is good to all of you out there. You'll hear from me again in 2021, and hopefully that'll be better still.
If you like the Here's How podcast, please rate and review the show on iTunes and other podcast providers. Share it on Facebook and Twitter. Tell your friends. But most of all, make your views heard. Call us on 076 603 5060.
I have on the line Kate McGrew. Kate is a seasoned performance artist, and her shows often reflect on her experience in the sex industry in New York, in her native United States, in Ireland, and also in Australia. She brought the conversation into Irish living rooms when she outed herself as a sex worker in the RTE2 series Connected, and her new show Horrorcore will be premiering in Dublin as soon as COVID allows. And Kate, you're the main speaker for an organisation called Sex Workers Alliance of Ireland. What is that, and what do you do in it?
Thanks, William. Yes, Sex Workers Alliance Ireland is Ireland's only sex worker-led and centered sex work organization that frontline service that helps sex workers, all of Ireland's sex workers, with whatever it is they need. If they're housing issues, if they're issues when they've been victims of crime, we help with them even being able to advocate for and get their own experiences out into the media. We help people to get refugee status if they've needed it, and we're really concerned with fighting for the right to safety in their lives and in their work, and also of self-determination of all of Ireland's sex workers.
And what do you say to people who hear that and maybe clutch their pearls and say, this is prostitution, prostitution is a terrible thing? How do you respond to that type of an attitude?
Well, what we're really looking for is that there is as safe as possible of an environment within the sex industry. So if, like us, people are concerned with people who don't want to do sex work whatsoever, or who become vulnerable once they're in the sex industry. On this end, what we are arguing for is everything around prevention. So we're looking for essentially viable alternatives to doing sex work. It's already an industry that where people are engaging who happen to be on the margins of society.
So wait with that there. Happen to be on the margins of society. Are you sure that's just a coincidence? Isn't it much more likely that people who are marginalised, people who are vulnerable, are ending up in sex work because they're marginalised and vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that that's kind of the key, in a way, that so often people do sex work when they have little to no other options. And so again, what we're looking for is alternatives to employment, trans employment alternatives, or other ways for migrants, particularly undocumented migrants, to survive, for people to get out of domestic violence situations that don't necessarily have to do with selling sex to survive. Supports around drug use and homelessness. So what we're looking for is alternatives so that people don't have to engage with sex work if they don't want to. But the fact is, we acknowledge that it does exist, that it will exist. It always has, and frankly, it always will. And so realistically, we do advocate for the harm reduction legislative policies of decriminalization, so that once people are realistically in the sex industry, at least they'll have legal, safe avenues within the industry.
Okay, you talked there about decriminalization, and about 5 years ago on this podcast, I talked to a woman who at the time was the CEO of Ruhama, that's Sarah Benson, and I just want to play a clip of that podcast for you to listen to.
Thousands of women were essentially kept as slaves in those laundries. They were treated horrendously. They were unlawfully imprisoned. They had babies taken away from them. In some cases, death certificates forged when their babies were sold to in illegal adoptions to the United States.
Absolutely, all of those things are.
Hold on for 1 second. No, I just want to.
I'm
go ahead.
not a member of the Good Shepherd Sisters. Neither have I been a member of Our Lady of Charity. I'm not.
Is Ruhama a front group?
No, it is not a front group. I think if you want to inquire about all those incredibly important and valid questions, which are a matter of both the state and the church to address, then the interview probably needs to be addressed towards a representative of that order.
I understand that, and I want to focus on Ruhama.
Well, certainly there are legacy issues which relate to a large number of things which were done, particularly in relation to women and children. They're not a matter for Ruhama to address, and this is...
Sure, I understand that, and I want to address Ruhama.
We did issue a statement going back a number of years because, to be honest, this is something that is a red herring that gets thrown out, and it is something that is thrown out as a silencing tactic, which I think only demonstrates that, you know, those who run and profit from the sex trade are not willing to actually stand up and have a conversation about what it is we actually do, which is work on this issue with women who are living the experience.
Sarah, I absolutely don't want to silence you, and I understand that you're not responsible for the Magdalene laundries, but I do want to ask you questions that are specifically related to Ruhama, and the fact that it was established by those two orders is relevant. And for example, in 2011, which is only a couple of years ago, Sister Sheila Murphy and Sister Bernie McNally, who I believe were from respectively the Sisters of Our Lady of Charity and the Good Shepherd Sisters, they were both contacted by the Justice for Magdalene's group. I have the text of their responses, and they are...
William,
I just want to focus on this. They were dripping... I want to ask you a question directly of Ruhama. Those two women gave responses, refused to meet the Justice for Magdalene's in responses that were dripping with contempt. Can I just ask, did those two women specifically have an association with Ruhama?
They were both previously board members of Ruhama. They had no special, they were directors in the same way as all members of the board are directors, voluntary directors, and the board is constituted as a charity in that respect. So they both previously were board members. However, the matter of their engagement with any of the processes around the Justice for Magdalene's, the review, were a matter for their work as the orders.
But they were very senior members of those orders that founded Ruhama.
Yes, but that had no bearing on the work of Ruhama.
And they were directors also of Ruhama.
So, Kate, I played you that because I wanted to give a flavour of the interview that I'd done with Sarah Benson of Ruhama. That was obviously quite a tense interview. And I know that you have an attitude, an opinion about the legal position on prostitution in Ireland now, which was essentially promoted by Ruhama, which is called the Swedish model, which is that it is illegal and quite a serious criminal offence for someone, I guess typically a man, to buy sex, to pay for sex. How do you feel about that in SWAI?
Oh, that was quite a clip.
Yeah.
The Swedish model, it's interesting that you perceive that the sort of the aim around it is to position purchasing sex as a serious crime, because the reality of what the law looks like, what's being policed and enforced, is that it's sex workers ourselves whose workplaces are dispersed, who are pushed into darker corners, who are less likely to report to Gardaí, and also who are arrested ourselves for co-working. Essentially, they call it brothel keeping. If I share a workspace with just one other person, they call that brothel keeping. And under this legislation we've had for 3 years, workers face double the amount of penalties and a jail sentence for this so-called crime. And women are right now serving jail sentences for this very situation, basically working for a friend for safety or because it's cheaper that way. Now, to purchase sex, which became illegal in the past 3 years, the men are faced with a €500 fine. Now, we don't suggest that our clients be arrested at all. It still presents a whole host of problems for us and makes us work in more dangerous settings and ways. But it certainly goes to show that if what they are slapped with under the law is so much less of a penalty than what we are, it becomes more and more clear that this is really just an anti-prostitution and an anti-immigration law.
Pause on that. that because I want to examine those two possibilities. So you're saying that the two things that can land you with a criminal conviction in Ireland in relation to prostitution, number one is what's called brothel keeping. And that's not specifically being the sex worker. That's being someone who is working in conjunction with them. And, that traditionally might have been called being a pimp or being a madam, and somebody who is not the person who's having sex for money, but who is making money from the operation. That's regarded still as quite a serious crime. And also, as you say, far lower penalties if you are the, and again, almost always male person who's paying for sex. You can end up with a fine and also perhaps a criminal conviction that would have maybe very serious reputational issues for you. You're saying, in opposing Ruhama's position, you're saying that both of those things should not be a crime as you see it. Am I right?
Well, to clarify, the brothel keeping law is purported to tackle exploitative bosses. But what it happens is that people are getting arrested merely for working in pairs or groups. So while they say the brothel keeping law is to target people who are profiting off of somebody else's work, people are getting arrested, they're getting fined, they're getting put in jail for merely working as an independent worker next to or with a friend from a workspace. So just to clarify, because that's a really important detail, it's workers themselves who are suffering from this law.
Are you aware of specific instances where people in that situation have ended up with convictions?
We certainly are. In fact, just the other day in Waterford, somebody pled guilty to brothel keeping, not knowing, because she didn't have representation, that she can, at least she can try to push back and say this is not how this law is intended. But what happens is that people are ending up in court with no representation, and so they're just being told just plead guilty and get this over with. So we do know of multiple cases, as I said, where people are serving jail sentences for brothel keeping.
Okay. And anybody who perhaps took the opinion that prostitution, that paid sex work is not a good thing and they just opposed it flat out, you could still have a valid opinion that even if it's happening, it is better that perhaps, and again, it's almost all, not always, but very predominantly women, two or more women working together is a safer situation than one person working who then is vulnerable to exploitation and perhaps vulnerable to violence. Is that your position on that?
We have never suggested or focused on whether or not sex work is empowering or exploitative. What we have focused
Sure, but there's a bunch of people who are flatly against it. Sometimes for maybe religious or moralistic reasons, but sometimes for very genuine concern for safety and so forth. And it is possible to make the argument to them that, okay, you're against this, but it's happening and it's better that it happens this way rather than that way.
What I'm driving towards is exactly that, is that we acknowledge that sex work is an industry where there is a particular potential for exploitation due to criminalization, due to stigmatization, racism, and misogyny. It's for that reason that we advocate for harm reduction laws, such as decriminalization, for vetted options, and for realistic recourse to justice. We want to be able to work with Gardaí to help eradicate the worst of abuses that can and do occur, instead of being distant, instead of saying, oh, I don't know if I should report this crime. Is this police officer going to then for the rest of the month be camped outside my place to harvest the rest of my good clients? Because
so this what you're referring to maybe is a sex worker who has a client who ends up beating her up or threatening her with violence or committing some other crime against her. She may be afraid to report that to the police, even though now, as the law has been changed, as you said, about 3 years ago, she is not committing a crime, but her clients are, and that fact can be enough to trigger legal pressure on her.
I mean, we do understand why people, when you don't think through the steps of our experiences, they think, oh, that sounds like it should make sense that we feel safer to report. We're absolutely more distanced from authorities now. There has been such an increase in violence against us since this change in law. I mean, all of this talk in the media, all of our struggle against it, unfortunately, has shone a light on our vulnerability whilst doing nothing to protect us. So when you really go through the steps, you go, okay, we've seen a 92% increase in violent crime against us. That's at the same time we've seen a near 20% decrease in the amount of people that are willing to make reports. We have so many increased reasons to not engage with Gardaí, which is just a really frustrating experience. That's why we try and center sex workers' voices who are working under this legislation now so they can hear why it really doesn't work.
Okay, that's your pitch for essentially decriminalizing both the selling and the buying of sex. Let me put to the opposite opinion, and I'll give you an opportunity then to respond to that. People say that there will always be prostitution, and that's probably true. But that isn't necessarily a slam dunk reason to make it legalized. You could say there will always be murder, and the laws against murder will always fail to some extent. But that's not a good reason to legalize murder. And isn't it possible that a small and possibly dangerous prostitution, sex work industry is better than having an industrial scale legalized sex work that draws in a far larger number of women?
So the reason why we advocate for decriminalization specifically is because it's a more flexible legal model. So when you look at places like Holland and Germany, there is so much power that's afforded to the state. There is such a high bar of regulation and a very limited way that you can work that it basically makes for a very big black market once again. But if you look at the laws that they have in some places in Australia and in New Zealand, they're more flexible models. People work overwhelmingly there in what are essentially called small owner-operated brothels. So it's up to 4 workers working together with no boss, just sharing a space to be able to work. I mean, we need to realize and understand that criminals, the money for them, the opportunity for them is in an illegal landscape. They know that they have more position and more opportunity to take advantage of our lack of options when we don't have any. So we also know that that this so-called desire to end demand, it just simply doesn't work. People are not working in the sex industry because...
Sure, pause. Kate, pause on that. I think you're 100% right. I think the chance of ending demand...
They need money to survive.
Hold on that for a second. I think you're right that the chance of ending demand is 0. But it is possible to very seriously curtail it.
How would you think that is possible? How do you think that
first of all, I'll have to put my hand up and say that I think you have an awful lot more on the ground experience on this than I do. But I would imagine, and it strikes me as fairly evident, that a society where for a man going to a sex worker is so destigmatized as to be almost normal, perhaps not normal for the entire whole of society, but within certain subgroups in society, that there is just a greater quantum, that it's just a much bigger thing in a society than in a society where it is hugely taboo.
Unfortunately, there's just no evidence to support what you suppose there. So even in Sweden, where they've had this law for the past 20 years, the police forces themselves will say there will always be a sex industry here. The sex industry, when they brought in this end demand model, moved indoors. It was the time when the internet was kicking off. The fact is, nowhere does evidence show that a sort of normalizing effect of how we perceive sex work makes a great increase in clients. And we'll also say it's more that we want to focus on the safety of the worker as opposed to how we perceive clientele. Frankly, we're just trying to be realistic about what it is that workers need on a day-to-day basis to stay as safe as possible.
Okay, sure. And you, I think, are an exceptional person in particular in the way that you have spoken out and in the way that you have essentially come out as a sex worker in Ireland. You've got a particular background. I mentioned you're from the United States. I think it would be fair to say that your profile is radically different to most of the women working in the sex industry in Ireland. In your experience, what's the typical profile of a woman doing that in Ireland?
A single mother.
And that's it?
A single mother is overwhelmingly the profile of a sex worker. I mean, it definitely is.
And in terms of education?
Colorful variety of people. There are a lot of migrants. There are a lot of people that have third level educations as well. The thing about being a spokesperson for sex worker rights is the reason why I'm able to do that is, for example, because I don't have children. And so the reality is that people are doing this work to raise families. People are doing this work to buy houses, to start up other businesses, to put themselves through schools. There's certainly a huge number of young people who, due to increased cost of living and housing, are starting to do sex work. So
okay. And just to clarify on one of the things you said there are many migrants in it. There are some people, Irish people, who have third level education. What's the ratio there?
Part of the challenge of being in the sex industry and of fighting for our rights and advocating for safe laws is that we are a challenging group to be able to research because people just have realistic needs for privacy. We've seen people with their kids taken off them. We've seen them get evicted, even if illegally they don't have the support to go through the courts. So it's really hard to get a perfect sort of look at exactly who we are. But
you're on the ground, and I'm guessing that you have a good. Come on, Casey. I'm guessing that you have a pretty good take on it.
Of Grindr, they work out of gyms, they work in more opportunistic settings. So even like this huge population of male sex workers are getting completely ignored. And they have a whole host of different needs that are around, HIV rates rising and around chemsex. So we are a very diverse population.
Yeah, but you're somebody who is on the ground and you know the lie of the land. What is your sense, if you were to have the best guess that you have on the ratio of people, of let's say women who are migrants, maybe undocumented, versus Irish women who have third level education?
Particularly the Irish women tend to work more privately, even more so than migrant workers. I'd say mostly there are migrant workers who are EU nationals. There's a huge population of people that are doing that. And again, we work with them. We host drop-ins where people can come into a private space and talk to us about any of their concerns. So it's unfortunate that that they don't get as much of a sort of don't feel as safe to get their stories out there because they just feel that people are very wary and suspicious and judgmental of them. And so it's understandable that they're really just trying to do work to survive. And so they'd rather just get on with it.
Okay, let me tell you where I'm coming from on this. I think that there's been a huge amount of prejudice against women in particular in sex work. I think that a lot of that has come from extremely negative feelings towards them, particularly historically, and that laws on prostitution were really, can hardly argue against it, were targeted against sex workers, and they were treated incredibly badly and had very little access to justice when they were the victims of crime. And I think that is an outrage at every step. But I don't think that necessarily follows that saying that if we flip that position 180, that's necessarily a good idea. In particular, because if you are someone, and you mentioned EU workers, and I know that people come particularly from Eastern Europe to Ireland, it can be a terrible thing. It can lead to terrible outcomes for young women, sometimes very young women, when they have the opportunity to essentially ditch their education and make what seems to them like a huge amount of money. That might be a career opportunity that's on a very short fuse, but that's not that's not something that they might have a high degree of awareness for. It's possible that somebody could either voluntarily or with a small amount of coercion be brought into the sex industry at a relatively young age, and that have an enormously damaging effect on the rest of their lives. That is a possibility, isn't it?
It's part of the reason why we just try and get as many workers as possible to be connected to Sway, because again, when we're working in a quasi legal industry, when we're dealing with people who feel that they don't have many options that they either have available to them or that suit them for their lives for whatever reason, it's essential that we be able to help people address any kinds of concerns or abuses that they're suffering. And also, of course, the answer is always, 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 William, the preventative part. It's what do people need to not have to do sex work. That is always the crux of the matter. And so whilst we work together for anybody concerned with people doing this work that they're not comfortable with, whilst we work together towards prevention of that, we have to make laws that make people as realistically safe as possible. So that's why it's essential. It's really good to have conversation with, people like yourselves and people that might not know a lot about it, so that you can understand. It's prevention that is really where we need to focus.
Yeah.
That's where your concerns are addressed.
I agree with that, and in particular, I agree with your point on safety and protecting people. But if you're someone, and perhaps a girl without a great academic strengths, whose options are working in a McDonald's or working in a relatively low wage job, which might be the only option for some other people, you can see how getting into prostitution, which would, especially for somebody quite young, especially for somebody coming from a relatively low wage country, that could seem enormously tempting for a relatively short period in life, but that then would have a huge impact on the rest of their lives. Are you saying that prohibition can have no value in that context?
Absolutely. It merely exacerbates people's problems, particularly, when they do raids of clients here. What we have seen is that for, a couple of weeks, demand will go down a bit. And what that means is that people are left with clients who they would not have taken before. So, and that's a real, a real concern. We have had people come to us that have ended up...
Kate, just to pause on that, because I just want to make sure that that's clear for the listeners. So what you're saying is that there are some raids, Garda raids. That means that the number of clients that are available to a sex worker is lower, and then perhaps out of desperation, they accept clients that would otherwise be, a red flag type person that you don't want to go near, where they might otherwise not do that.
That's right. We've heard so many people tell us that it's the criminalization and the stigmatization. It's these aspects that create the psychological stress and harm to them. And when people are experiencing psychological stress and harm due to the actual work themselves, we need to find out, what do people need to get out of sex work and be able to find viable alternatives to survival? What do people need to have never had to do that in the first place? Those are really the only things to focus on, because day by day, these are the urgent matters for these very women. If we want to help them, those are the things we have to worry about first.
Okay. Last question. What does it say on your tax return?
You can ask my accountant. You can ask my accountant. It says self-employed anyways. So, and I do pay my taxes. That's the thing, during this pandemic, it's been very frustrating that we've had no support whatsoever. We did a hardship crowdfund, and we were able to give little bits of money out to people because overwhelmingly we weren't able to avail of the unemployment payments. I happen to be registered as self-employed, but very few people are, for the reasons that I described to you before, that they experience discrimination. So we do recognize that if we could work with more legality, more of us would be able to work with more stability, and that would include things like paying taxes. So, the Department of Justice, while they gave money to an anti-sex work organization, they refused to give it to us based on the fact that we talk about sex work as an economic activity. But, the Department of Justice shouldn't be making policy or funding decisions based on ideology, but on outcomes. And what we're talking about is a global pandemic, an emergency crisis situation where we were just left with no help whatsoever, except for amongst ourselves. So we really hope that we can just move towards a society and a state that can help us in the ways that we are asking and directing, that we can be helped.
Kate McGrew, the spokesperson for the Sex Workers Alliance of Ireland, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thanks, William. Have a good night.
Make your view heard. Record your own contribution and email it to podcast@here'show.ie. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter @Here'sHowPodcast, and follow Sex Workers Alliance of Ireland @SWAI Ireland. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or topic for a show in 2021. And thanks again to all the patrons on Patreon. Their donations allow me to devote more time to research and to finding interesting guests and to interviewing them and editing and pushing the podcast on the web. If you think you could do the same as those donors and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, please go to patreon.com